I think it's kind of checking you feel comfortable yourself because quite a lot of, people on courses and in supervision groups say they feel scared of doing harm. So to me, it's exploring in yourself your own scared parts. And as we were saying earlier, I mean, I do always do it in my intake, in my very first appointment. I check if people have had any experience of it, any actual attempts or any suicidal ideation. So I kind of flag that up at the beginning. And so that's kind of how I've, I guess, broken the taboo, broken the silence on it by naming it in the very first session. Because sometimes doing deep EMDR can make people feel worse.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are talking with Annabel McGoldrick about a very important and sensitive topic today about suicide. I know it's a heavy topic, and we are going to do a little meditation in just a couple of minutes. But before we get to that, first of all, welcome wherever you're from. And I'm always interested in knowing where people are from. So if you don't mind putting in a chat who you are and where you're from, and maybe if you had a client who ever committed suicide, because that happens. That I think even happens more, has been happening more lately. So yes, if you can just put where you're from. Welcome, Kathy, Sarah from the UK. And we have a member from Tunisia and UK and from Kenya and from Ireland and UK. This is so exciting for me to see
This is
our
so
members from
cool.
all over. Yes. So, Annabelle, before we do our
I
meditation, do you
know.
want to maybe say hi, who you are? I know you're in the UK now, but you kind of spend your time between Australia and the UK, and a
I
little bit
do.
who you are and what you do.
Yes, I'm a global citizen. So I've got to the stage of life where my husband, as an academic, can take half the year off, and so we spend half the year in the UK, where my son's at university, and half the year in Australia. But that's what COVID did for us. We can all now work online, which is just fabulous. So I can see my clients in Australia, in America, in the Middle East while I'm here in the UK. So I do feel really lucky about that. And I've got really excited about integrating EMDR with internal family systems therapy. I was very honoured to give a presentation at the UK EMDR conference about that. So that was exciting. I've also got two chapters in a new book that's coming out. There's a bit of a zeitgeist about IFS-Informed EMDR. So I know that David Polidi is a member of your community too, Rotem. He's
Yes, and
pulled
he
together.
will be our guest in, I forget if it's October or November, but yes, we will when the book is out. We timed it right.
Yeah.
We didn't know exactly when the book's going to be out, but we timed it just right. So the book's going to be out, and we're going to have David talk about massive project of a book, IFS
Massive
Informed
project.
EMDR. Yes.
He's a bit of a superhero to me. He's a very modest man, but the way he's kind of coordinated more than 20 authors to write their own take on creative collaborative approaches to IFS-informed EMDR. So whatever I share or teach, there's many other ways of doing it because it really is. There's a little bit like Mark talks about unleashing your EMDR with attachment focus. I mean, to me, it's kind of finding a sense of energy and adventure and no session is ever boring when we're discovering parts and befriending them. And that's why I thought this topic would be interesting, because a lot of therapists get really scared of parts and clients when they start to develop suicidal ideation. So working with IFS informed EMDR isn't a magic solution, as all of you know, but it can be a way of kind of making it feel a bit safer, a bit more collaborative, and help reduce the fear for the therapist as well as for the client, because those parts they get a really bad rap, I think, and all they're trying to do is just help the client escape their pain and distress and trauma. So does this feel a good moment for us to go inside and do a little meditation? Because I am aware it's a
Yes.
really big topic.
Yes, we're 5 minutes in, so we'll do a short meditation because it's a heavy topic, and Annabelle had this idea, which I think is a great idea. So we'll do a short meditation, and then we will talk about the topic of today, which is suicide and part.
Great. Thank you. So just take a moment to go inside, to connect with, discover, befriend any parts of you holding any thoughts, any feelings, any reactions to the mention of the word suicide. The word can bring up so much for each of us in very, very different ways. If you're not comfortable with parts language, that's fine. Just notice any aspects of you. Any aspects of you holding any thoughts or feelings, sensations, or memories. And just begin by taking some deep breaths. You don't have to change your breath in any way right now. Just bring your attention there. That can be so calming, so soothing. To bring our attention to the breath. And maybe you just want to take my words as an invitation rather than an instruction. And just ask your system if it's okay to focus on these parts, these aspects of you. Holding anything about or anything about the words that can be such a taboo, so uncomfortable. Death by suicide. Maybe there's a person you may be thinking of today who died that way, or who hurt themselves that way. Or maybe a suicide attempt is part of your own story. Just notice what comes up for you. Your parts, aspects of you. Notice any thoughts, feelings, sensations, reactions. Maybe there's someone you miss. Maybe someone you remember with love and fondness, a family member, a colleague, a client. Or maybe there are some uncomfortable feelings, disturbing feelings, anger perhaps, that they chose suicide as their way to escape their pain. Or maybe this is part of your own history, your own pain, your own trauma and distress. So many of us are wounded healers. Just see if it's possible to welcome all your parts, all your thoughts, all your feelings, no matter how negative, how uncomfortable, how confusing, how painful suicide can be for any of us, in any role. Is it possible to welcome all parts of you? To give them all permission to be here? Notice how you feel towards the parts that are showing up, even the conflicted parts. Is it possible to send them some compassion? Some curiosity, perhaps, to each of these feelings, thoughts, or aspects of you. If there are parts blocking you, blocking that compassion or curiosity, just notice them. Maybe ask them what their concern is. Can you address their concerns? Maybe they can give you a little bit of space to explore how to make sense of what's here today. Because this topic is both personal and professional. Just continue asking for space from all your parts until you notice your heart is maybe a little bit more open. Maybe your stomach feels a little bit softer towards these parts or aspects of you. Maybe your head feels a little bit lighter. Your breath might be coming in a little bit slower. Is there one part in particular that needs your attention? Or are there several parts? Maybe just notice how these parts are showing up in your body. Again, ask them for space. And if there's one part or several parts, now they have your attention, what do they want you to know? What do they want you to remember? What do they need from you? Maybe they need you to say or to ask something specific in the webinar today. Notice how it feels hearing their needs. Maybe they just need to be heard. Often parts just need to be seen and heard and validated. Maybe they just need that little bit of compassion you were offering earlier. Maybe there's a little bit of gratitude for what they've shared. See if you can send those warm feelings to the part or parts who shared. Let them know that you've heard them. We'll be drawing the meditation to a close. Do whatever you need to do. Have a stretch, take a breath. Prepare to bring your attention back into the room. Maybe even take a moment to write down what you've been told by your parts or what memories or thoughts have come up. Maybe there's something confidential just for you to explore inside later. Maybe in some journaling or some therapy. Just take a moment to end this meditation for you and your parts. When you're ready to rejoin the webinar back to our shared global space.
Thank you, Annabelle. That's a really good way to start a webinar, especially on that topic.
Does anybody want to share or ask anything that came up? I know as people you don't know, maybe there are some people you know. Rotem's just shared an article I wrote at the end of last year with Mark Brain, because I think Kathy from the UK, you were at the webinar we had to remember a UK EMDR colleague called Nadia Wyatt, who'd committed suicide the previous year. Actually, I shouldn't say that word. You know, it kind of comes out by accident, committed. I think took her life by suicide. Anyway, we had a webinar in the UK for people to remember Nadia and to talk about this topic. And Mark and I wrote that article, and there's some really good references in there, references to help you as an EMDR therapist and useful statistics and books to turn to. So I highly recommend you read that.
Thank you, Annabelle. I wanted to start our conversation by asking you about parts. You're known in our community for as someone who integrates EMDR and IFS. And from that perspective, from the perspective of IFS and parts, what is actually happening? Why do people die by suicide?
Well, if you actually want to know why people die by suicide, that is one of the books quoted in the article by a man called Thomas Joyner, who actually starts the book about losing his dad.
Mm.
So I kind of traverse two aspects. One's the kind of psychological theory, and one is the IFS theory. So I'll come back to Thomas Joyner in a moment because he makes some really important points for us all, I think, to be aware of as therapists, even if we're not integrating IFS. From an IFS point of view, parts that are kind of locked in suicidal ideation, sometimes obsessing about the method, kind of flooded with thoughts about it. They're called firefighters in IFS. So firefighters are the parts that kind of go, panic, panic, panic. You know, I think the name kind of covers it really well. I kind of think of them as kind of little people inside with a fire hose trying to put the fire of the emotion out. So they're usually protecting little exiles, the little parts who hold often the big, really disturbing attachment wounds that have been kind of pushed out the system. So if people get really triggered by something in everyday life that activates all those attachment wounds. I mean, I have a lot of clients with those attachment wounds, but they don't feel them as memories. They feel them as being flooded with terror, flooded with anxiety. So all a suicidal part is to me is a firefighter trying to put out that intense emotion that the client can't escape from. And when those flashbacks, those somatic emotional flashbacks don't come with memories, people think they're going crazy and they don't know what's going on because the incident that happened today might be that size, but they're having emotion that's that size. That's all that attachment stuff back there. It's all the little exiles kind of freaking out, feeling completely abandoned, feeling like they're going to die. And I mean, that's not conscience. That's just kind of what's flooding the whole system. So that's my kind of IFS take on suicidal
Right,
parts.
right. So it's not only the firefighters and it's not only the exiles, but a lot of times there's these interactions, right, between or among parts.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, managers can get involved as well because managers are kind of forward planning. They're kind of, it's the same with addiction. When people are addicted to drugs and alcohol, it's not just the firefighters going, oh, shit, 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 I've got to have a drink to get rid of it. It's like the managers are trying to plan, trying to coordinate. So I see managers when people's suicidal ideation is escalating, that's what we always ask, isn't it? Have you got a plan? So that to me is
Mhm.
asking the managers, have the managers got involved here? Are the
Mm,
managers looking
that
for
is
a,
an interesting perspective, right? If the manager
yeah,
is involved, we should be more concerned.
yeah. I mean, I am just gonna reference Thomas Joyner here because he says in his book, why people, I think it's called Why People Die by Suicide. Um, why people die by suicide. One of the things he says we need to look out for is if people are actually habituating themselves to harm. So they're kind of rehearsing it because hurting yourself, there's a natural default. Oh, I don't want to do that. That's horrible. So people kind of practice I mean, it sounds awful, but when they start to go and look at railway lines and imagine throwing themselves off, they start to practice self-harm. This habituation is kind of reducing the fear of actually taking that action. So I see, I mean, that's an interaction between kind of managers and firefighters together. But that's something to be really attentive to, is the more people kind of rehearse it, the more they're reducing the fear of doing it. And, you know, if you read the coroner's report on Nadia's death, the EMDR therapist, that's actually part of her story. That's what the coroner noted. So that's really important. The other aspect is feeling like a burden. Now, these come up as negative cognitions, don't they, for EMDR? So they're really helpful for us to kind of get the roots of the trauma. But when people feel like a burden, what do you do? So that's kind of often critics inside. They're often managers inside going, "You're a burden. You don't matter. Nobody wants to
Mhm.
listen to you." So you can kind of feel what happens then. So when the person goes to pick up the phone, it's like there's a voice going, "Well, nobody cares about you. You're just a burden. You're always complaining." So again, you can see that interaction between, you know, parts who are trying to reach for help and critics who are kind of going, "No, you're a burden." What's the other one? "I don't belong." That kind of lack of belongingness. So again, these are really great targets in EMDR, but they're also parts to me in IFS that we're trying to get to know. So when people feel like they don't belong, they feel like they're a burden, and they also feel like this pain is never going to end. So it is kind of our job to help them realize that it'll pass. But I mean, that can be blowing hard, Rotem. You know, you've been there with people. So, you know, I'll make this sound like it's easy. It's not. It's not easy
No, no,
at all.
I know it's not easy, but I think it's a really, really important topic to talk about. And I think that I often say to clients that many people who even don't go to therapy have suicidal thoughts. It doesn't mean that, I'm going to push a button and, four people will come and take you into like a psychiatric unit if you talk about your suicidal thoughts. This is a place, therapy is a place to talk about it. And unless you're telling me that you have a very concrete plan to hurt yourself, then nothing's going to happen. I think that a lot of clients are afraid to talk about it, but also a lot of therapists are afraid.
Yeah, and I think that's so important what you've just named then. It's just reminded me of another statistic I found really helpful. It's not in the article, but I don't know if you've read that book, The Happiness Trap. Anyway, he says in there that almost 1 in 2 people will at some point seriously consider suicide and struggle with it for 2 weeks or more. 1 in 2 people.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's really common, really normal, really healthy. And yeah, absolutely. I really, I always think if clients are talking to us about it, we've got a much better chance of helping them believe that it's going to pass, find other ways out, get to the root of the trauma about it. I mean, I was just saying this to you earlier that in the article is another statistic that says apparently 59% of psychologists report some kind of suicidal ideation at some point. So that means psychologists and mental health professionals like us are at a higher risk of suicide than the
Well,
general
as you
population.
mentioned in the meditation, a lot of us are wounded healers, right? So um, probably more likely than the general population, maybe. I don't know. I I'm wondering, Annabelle, if you have any advice to, our members who are EMDR therapists. Some of them are trained in IFS, but let's say not trained in IFS, how to talk about that? How would you advise to therapists to approach clients and talk about suicide or suicidal parts, or just to have this conversation?
Well, I think it's kind of checking you feel comfortable yourself because quite a lot of, people on courses and in supervision groups say they feel scared, scared of doing harm. So to me, it's exploring in yourself your own scared parts. And as we were saying earlier, I mean, I don't kind of say as someone walks in the door, oh, you thought about killing yourself today? That would be a good idea. I mean, I do always do it in my intake, in my very first appointment. I check if people have had any experience of it, any actual attempts or any suicidal ideation. So I kind of flag that up at the beginning. And so that's kind of how I've, I guess, broken the taboo, broken the silence on it by naming it in the very first session. I
Yeah.
find that can be very helpful. And like you say, just saying, because sometimes doing deep, deep, deep EMDR can make people feel worse. So it's saying if you
Right.
feel worse and that comes up, that actually means we're doing good work. I mean, it's, this thing about an ab reaction, as Francine said in the third edition, one person's ab reaction is another person's processing.
Mm.
So it's kind of always opening the space. That's nice. Rebecca Rodriguez says IFS helped her become comfortable with talking about this part with clients. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess the thing to start with, if you're not familiar with parts language, that's okay. That's why I phrased the meditation as I did. Maybe it's an aspect of you. Maybe it's just a thought or a feeling. So, I mean, there's a whole kind of debate about what parts are parts little people who live inside. Now, in IFS land, they very much are little people that live inside. But I kind of like to hold things lightly. And some clients actually hate that concept. And I remember
Mm.
one man kind of almost walking out the door when I referred to parts. He was like, I'm not going to talk about fairies that live down the garden. Don't be so ridiculous. So it's like, well, how can I open ears with my client? I also have a background in peace studies, and it's, let's talk the language of the client. Let's not make them talk my language. I mean, that's what EMDR is not very good. EMDR kind of has secret words and codes and goodness knows what. And it's like, well, how can I find a language that works for the client?
I want to challenge you on that one, Annabella, and say that EMDR therapists and IFS therapists, if you're good, you don't have to use that language with the client. You can use it with your colleagues and, like nerd up about EMDR and IFS and, terminology and neural networks and parts and whatever. But when you work with a client, I agree with what you said before. Learn the language of the client and have them, right? Like, you think about the concept of self in IFS. There's so many
Yeah,
ways
I
to
don't use
describe it.
that.
Is
I
yeah,
don't. Yeah.
no. But I'm saying I'm not. You don't have to use the self with capital self. But for people who are
Yeah,
more
I agree
religious,
with
it
you.
can be God. For people who are more
Totally.
uh, technically oriented, it can be from a heart math perspective, it can be when your nervous system is in a coherent state, or when your heart and brain are in a coherent state, you're in self. So
Yeah,
you don't
absolutely.
have to use
Absolutely.
the terminology with a client.
I totally couldn't agree more, Rotam. Absolutely spot on. I mean, that's why in the meditation I didn't refer to self. I said, is it possible to show a little bit of compassion, a little bit of curiosity towards these parts? Just ask them to give you space and notice if you feel a bit softer towards them. So that's just finding the qualities of self, because I think that yes, I couldn't agree more. I think all therapies kind of have their own gobbledygook. Um, but just going back to your question about how to talk about suicide, I think the difference between a client saying, I am suicidal versus there is a part of me that is having suicidal thoughts, I think that just softens it. So instantly just seeing it, and I do like what, just back to this question of are the little people inside or not? I mean, if you talk to Dan Siegel, he says, no, they're not. They're just aspects of you. So that's why I like that language. It's just an aspect of you. And, you have daddy parts and you have EMDR learning community parts. And friendship and play part. So it's just different aspects of you. It doesn't matter. It's what's going to work. But I think if we just see it, what IFS brings is the idea that the part that looks like it wants to hurt you, looks like it wants to kill you. Maybe if we talk to it, this aspect of you, doesn't have to be a little person, what does it really want? It wants usually to find peace.
Hmm.
Usually it wants to just relieve you of the pain.
Yeah.
Wow, well, that's quite a different perspective. So that again, what I'm trying to do is bring that kind of softness inside. I'm trying to help people make sense of their inner world so it no longer feels scary. So some people feel a lot of shame about having a part that's, talking about suicide or bringing up images. They often feel really embarrassed about it. So if we can, like you said earlier, normalize it, 50% of people have those thoughts at some point, 59% of psychologists do. Completely normal. Let's just get to know this part and what it really wants for you, and how has it got any plans and things like that. So trying to help the client feel more friendly towards the part, because I don't know about you, if somebody comes along and says, right, you're not going to do that, you're not going to take that action, it just kind of puts up a defensiveness. So we're just kind of
Yeah, especially when you do
bringing the
that with
same
a,
softness. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So we're just trying to bring the same kind of softness, the same kind of welcome, the same kind of appreciation, because it just makes the whole system kind of feel a bit easier. So we're trying to take the conflict and the stress out and trying to understand why the part is doing that and what the real pain and trauma is underneath. I mean, at the discussion it wasn't a webinar, it was more a community gathering. Simon Proudlock, I don't know if you know of him in the EMDR world. He's done a lot of research. He's an EMDR trainer in the UK. You might have him on a webinar one day because he's done a lot of research into suicide, and he did one with people having an acute mental health crisis and actually showed that it was a good time to do EMDR because
Mm.
previously it was thought don't do it when people are actively suicidal. His research showed that yes, because the kind of cases he was discovering were, I mean, imagine if you'd had a child die and you'd never processed the trauma. Imagine if you'd witnessed some horrendous incident and never processed the trauma. It would make you kind of want to do anything to escape that pain and distress. So I think that's where EMDR as a tool for healing is really great for what the pain and distress suicidal parts are wanting to avoid or wanting to put the fire out on.
Yeah, I think that's probably would be one of the topics that people would continue to disagree on in the MDR community about, do you work with, do you actively reprocess traumatic memory with person who experienced suicidal thoughts or not? I heard different opinions about, what do you do when there's domestic violence in the house? And some people say yes, and some people say no. So it's, yeah. But I would be interested in learning more about the research, that person you mentioned.
Yeah, yeah. So in that article, I quote Simon quite a lot, and I reference several of his research articles on that. So he's quite adamant. I mean, obviously, you want to help people be stable, and I mean, one of the things I've heard IFS colleagues kind of contract with the suicidal part is, so the therapist says to the suicidal part, hey, you're really trying to help this client get some relief from this pain, this horrendous pain, this torment. I mean, torture. Torture is how one client talked about it today. What if we could bring some relief to that torture, but could you just hold off your plans for a few months while we go to work here? While we go to work, because it might feel a little bit bumpy while we're working with the trauma. But what if you could just take a break, suicidal part, while we do that? Would you be willing to do that? And we could check in. So that's another way of doing it, kind of actively contracting with the suicidal part just to take a pause. Now, Might not work with everyone, but that's just another way of doing it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That brings a lot of ways to work when kind of like that when we work with EMDR, we're working basically a lot of times with younger parts, right? Whether if we work with suicide or not. And I'm wondering if you can talk, Annabelle, a little about that hybrid, that integration of where EMDR meets IFS.
Well, I think that's what's so interesting about David's book that's coming out is the multiple ways in which people do it. I also forgot to mention, I think she's called Kendall Hart, is bringing out her own book on integrating EMDR and IFS. So she's just doing her own take on it. So
And there's a
to
third one
me,
about the topic that David told me. There's 3 books coming out
there's
about
actually three. Wow, it really is
IFS
a
and EMDR
zeitgeist at the moment.
integration. Yeah.
I mean, my thing is, I'm an EMDR therapist, so I don't start with IFS. I start with EMDR. And it's whenever parts pop out at any phase of EMDR. So I work with, well, I've worked with several people. I think there's another article I've written about instead of getting cautious, get curious, because it's also getting curious about your own parts. What are your parts that are getting triggered with clients? I mean, this is the thing about how short an EMDR training is. It doesn't kind of equip us with the complexity that our clients come with. So I've had a lot of clients who've had bad EMDR. I'm sure you've had a lot of those as well, Rotem. You know, the therapist either did processing too quick or too slow. I mean, I've equally met people who had kind of 20 sessions of history taken and never got to phase 4. It's like, what on earth is going on? I mean, you know, if I think about that person in particular, he had a very, very, very strong talking part that was very good at avoiding and going to the emotions. So it's how do we, to me, I'm all the time playing parts detector. So maybe that the client walks in the room. I mean, I had one client walk in the room and he was so all over the place. I actually felt scared. So I had to check in with my own parts because he wouldn't look at me, looked really disheveled. He was bursting into tears, he was shaking. And I had to kind of check in with my own parts and go, I'm actually a bit scared of this man. And I had to take a deep breath and I had to settle the scared young parts of me. First session, history taking. And I took a deep breath, settled my parts. I looked at him and I said, you know, I notice it's really hard for you to have eye contact with me.
Mm.
And he looked at me and he burst into tears and he said, I am so full of shame, I can't look at you. But it was suddenly like the connection was so powerful. And we then did some amazing EMDR, but it was just like I had to really settle my parts first. And then we were able to have this connection. And we didn't actually do that many sessions. He actually only did about 7 sessions. But what he concluded at the end was he'd been so triggered into a child part that he actually couldn't get out of bed and could hardly speak. So he'd spent several weeks in bed in a state of absolute terror and anxiety. And somehow, you talked about self energy, or his wise adult self kind of found me, came to see me. But it was only after we'd gone to some of A, the incidents to do with his marriage breakup, and B, you know, won't surprise you, his parents breaking up and all of their rows, that he was able to come back into his wise adult self and realize he was so blended with the child self. So that unblending is something I do a lot in EMDR because we talk about dual awareness, and it's, you know, not dissimilar to some of the things that Jim Knipe does with Loving Eyes, but I'm constantly trying to do it. I'm constantly, because it's like I've got an adult in the room who's completely blended with a 5-year-old. He was completely blended with a 4-year-old. The man was in his 70s. By the
Mm.
end of the therapy, he'd washed his hair, he'd got clean clothes, he'd fed himself, and he was caring for that little 4-year-old. So I'm all the time trying to unblend. In fact, I was actually just trying to do resources with somebody today. So, you know, the resource figures, nurturers, protectors, and wise beings. Now, some people are so triggered by that because their child self hasn't had that. So they
Mhm.
go into a state of panic that they can't think of a figure. And
Well, I
all it
think they
was,
sometimes they can think, but they can't really feel it, right? Like I think a good example is nurturing figure.
yeah.
When a person didn't have a nurturing figure growing up, they can think about it logically with their cognitions, but they can't really feel it on a somatic level.
Mm. But it was really interesting that the minute, several of them, she couldn't think of any, and then she couldn't feel them. And then when we started to go into it, what popped up was actually a little girl. So being able to unblend her from a little girl who was never allowed to be sad, and help her connect, a thing I often do is invite people to look at the hands. How old are those hands? My parts always go, oh my God, they're old lady hands. But it's a lovely way of doing the dual awareness, and just reach somebody else this morning in their 40s, just reach those 43-year-old hands towards that little 6-year-old who's feeling terrified. So this was in processing. I'm blending her from a wise adult self to connect with the little one in the memory, to feel compassion for the little one in the memory. So I'm all the time trying to work out, who am I talking to in my client? Is my client got enough access to that self energy of compassion and curiosity, or are they blended with a critical part, or a part that's filled with shame, and like the man couldn't look at me in the first session? So whatever phase I'm in, I'm all the time trying to suss out, who's here in the room. What do I need to do to kind of facilitate their maximum healing? Because that's what I like IFS gives me. I know the language of self energy isn't great, and I don't like it either, but it's how can I maximize the greatest kind of compassion and curiosity towards the part stuck in the memory, stuck in the distress, that need help with knowing that it's over. And I do like that idea that IFS does, where the wise adult self steps into the childhood memory, gives the child a hug, sits and listens to the child. So it's just making that dual awareness in processing, particularly childhood memories, just makes it so much safer. Because the reason to me so many childhood memories are so disturbing are because nobody was there, because they were alone, because they had a nightmare. The client this morning, she had a nightmare, and when she went to her mum and dad, she got shouted at, and all she needed was a cuddle, either cuddle in bed or to be put back to bed with a cuddle, but she didn't. She got shouted at. So it was the aloneness of the nightmare that was so awful. So having her 43-year-old self step in and sit with that little girl and listen to the nightmare, and that's normal, that nightmare. And sometimes we have the dream completion technique. We can say, what if we could change the end of the nightmare? But that's going somewhere else. But yeah, I am doing EMDR. It's just all the time I'm enhancing it with IFS interweaves, with a really much stronger, much more visual, much more specific dual awareness, so that I'm really conscious. I mean, I've got toys in my room, so I quite often will give a child, not a child, the child part, a toy to hold in my room. But it's also like a visual way. And online, see, my child part's just like any excuse to pick up the cuddly toys. That's all you've done here, right? But that's another way of helping the client unblend from their child part, because they can kind of see the child in the little toy, or the child's holding the toy. So
Yeah.
yes, I
Thank
mean,
you.
they're
That
not
was really good
exclusively
information, Annabelle. All
even more
right.
than me. Thank you so
Thanks for
much,
joining,
everyone.
everyone. Good to see you all.
Yeah, that was lovely. Thank you.